The washboard left her knuckles raw. For 30 years a Lakota chief wrapped her hands in hide. The sound was the first thing. A rhythmic slap and scrape coming from the far side of the house, steady as a heartbeat, and I pulled my horse up before I rounded the corner, because a man who walks into an unknown sound without thinking about it first doesn't live long enough to be old. I was old enough by then. I had the gray in my hair to prove it, and a back that reminded me of its opinions every morning, and a set of scars that told the story of 20 years of decisions, some good and some not. I came around the corner of the sod house on foot, horse behind me, and there she was. A woman at a wooden tub, bent over a washboard, working a shirt against the ridges with her whole body. Not her arms alone, her whole body, the weight of her putting itself through the cloth. She didn't look up. She didn't hear me, or she didn't care, and those are different things, and I wasn't sure yet which it was. Her hands were the color of old saddle leather, red at the knuckles. She had rolled her sleeves past the elbow, and her forearms were that same color, the color that comes from years of sun and water and lye soap, a color you can't wash off because it has become the skin itself. The veins stood up on the backs of her hands, blue dark, and the tendons moved under the skin when she worked. I stood there longer than I should have. Long enough that my horse got bored and put his nose down to sniff at a clump of dead grass, and the movement must have caught at the edge of her vision, because she looked up then. She looked at me the way some people look at a thing they don't understand yet, not afraid, not friendly, waiting to understand. I said I was looking for the man called Jensen, that I had come to trade. She said Jensen wasn't there. Said it without asking why I wanted him, without asking who I was. She looked at my horse instead, looked at it the way someone looks at a horse when they know horses, checking the shoulder, the hock, the way it carried its head. Then she said the horse needed water, and she pointed to the trough around the other side. She went back to the washboard. I took the horse to water, and I left without seeing Jensen that day. But I rode back toward our camp thinking about those hands, about what it takes to make a person's hands look like that. How many years, and how many loads of laundry, and how much cold water, and how much lye. That was the first time I saw Marta. I should tell you what I was then, so you understand what it meant that she looked at me that way. Or didn't look, which is closer to the truth. My name, the name my mother gave me, the name that belongs to me, I keep for myself and for my people. It is not a secret. It is just mine. The whites called me Hawk. Some called me the Chief, though that word means something different in their mouths than it does in mine. I led what remained of my band. 43 people that winter, where there had once been more than 200. I will not dwell on what happened to the others. That is its own story and not the one I am telling. We had moved with the season since before my grandfather's grandfather could remember. We knew every water source from the Black Hills east to the Big River. We knew the elk paths and the buffalo runs and the places where the wind came off the ridges at a certain angle in October and the deer would bunch in the draws below. That knowledge lived in us. It was not written in any book. And one by one, the places we knew were being changed into something we didn't recognize, plowed, fenced, named with names that meant nothing to the land, but that the land would learn anyway. The way land learns what is done to it and remembers. I am not a man who makes war on what he cannot change. Some of my people called that weakness. I called it watching. A man who watches long enough learns what can be moved and what cannot, and spends his strength only on what can be moved. I had enough strength left for the things that mattered, not more than that. The settlement at Crow Creek was 3 years old when I first rode to it to trade. 5 sod houses, a trading post, a pen of horses, a well they had to dig twice because the first one hit clay. The man Jensen ran the trading post. He was not kind, but he was fair, which in my experience is rarer and worth more than kind. He gave me powder and lead and salt and coffee for hides and certain plants that grew along the creek that the women in the settlement used for things I never asked about. The soldiers from the fort came sometimes and looked at me and looked at Jensen and didn't say much. A Lakota chief trading at a white settlement is a thing that doesn't fit easily into any of the stories soldiers tell themselves. I was supposed to be somewhere else, past the ridge, beyond the creek, further out. Not here, buying coffee, not looking like a man who does the same things as other men. But I kept coming back. The prices were fair and the route suited us, and I was, as I said, a man who watches. You learn a place by coming back to it. You learn the people the same way. Jensen told me things sometimes without being asked. He was that kind of man. He talked to fill silence the way some men drink to fill emptiness. I had learned to listen and not say much, which made him talk more. The second time I came to the settlement was late summer. The grass was still green near the creek, but the land away from the water had gone that pale gold that means the heat has had its way, and the ground has given up arguing. I saw her again at the washboard. She was doing sheets this time. Big, heavy things, wool or something near it, and the work was hard enough that she had to stop twice and straighten and press her fists into her lower back and then bend again. I watched her from the path for a moment. She didn't see me. I asked Jensen who she was. He said her name was Marta Bauer, said her husband had come out from somewhere east Ohio, maybe, or Pennsylvania, he wasn't sure, 12 years before, with the idea of farming the flat ground south of the creek. The land was flat enough, Jensen said, but the man wasn't built for it. Not his fault exactly. Some men weren't. Fever took him the third winter. He said it matter-of-factly, the way people say things that happen to other people. She stayed. Jensen shrugged when he said it, the shrug of a man who can't explain why someone did something that makes no sense to him. She stayed and she worked the claim, and she had raised some animals and put in a garden, and she was still here. I didn't ask more. I bought my salt and my lead and I went out. But when I rode away, I passed her yard, and I saw her hands close up for the first time. She was pulling a sheet off the line she'd strung between two posts, grabbing it with both hands and pulling it down in one motion, folding it in the air while it was still half wet. Her knuckle joints were swollen, round and hard-looking, like something that had been struck many times and had built up extra bone to deal with it. The backs of her hands were not just chapped, they were cracked, the way the clay flats crack in August, deep lines that caught shadow. She pulled down another sheet and folded it, and her face showed nothing. Not pain, not patience, nothing. She had gone somewhere past the point where those hands were something she thought about. They were just the tools she worked with. I rode back to camp, and I thought about that for a long time. October. I came for coffee and salt, and Jensen was out, riding to the fort to settle some account, and the man watching the trading post was young and had no idea what to do with me. He kept looking at the door like help might come through it. I was patient. I sat on the post step and waited. After a while, Marta came out of her house. She must have seen my horse, and she walked to the post without looking at me, and then she stopped and said, to the door more than to me, that Jensen wasn't back until dark. I said I knew how to wait. She said the coffee was in the bin on the left and the salt was in sacks in the back, and if I knew what I wanted I could write it down and leave what it was worth, and Jensen would settle it. I said I couldn't write what I wanted in English. She turned then and looked at me, really looked, the way she hadn't in the yard those other times. She took me in without the nervousness that most of the white people showed. She was calculating something. I could see her doing it. I didn't know what. She said in German, "Dan, read off Lakota, then speak Lakota." I said in Lakota that I wanted coffee and salt and powder, and I told her the amounts. She stood still, then she went inside. She came out with what I'd asked for and set it on the step beside me and named a price, the way Jensen priced things, and I gave her what she asked and tied the bundles to my horse. Before I rode out I said, "Dank, Frau Bauer." She was already walking back toward her house, but she stopped. She said, "You know German?" I said only a few words, and what to pay for things. She said, "Where did you learn?" I said, "A man named Kleiner ran a trading post north of here for a few years. He came from somewhere in Bavaria. He was a good man and he liked to talk." She turned a little. She said, "What happened to him?" I said he went back. His wife was ill. She looked at me for a moment with something I couldn't name exactly. Not sympathy, not warmth, something more like acknowledgement. Like she was filing something away. She walked back to her house. I rode out. But after that I knew her name, not just what Jensen called her. And there is a difference between knowing someone's name and knowing who they are, but it is a beginning. The raiders hit for the first time in November. They came at night, 4 or 5 of them, moving along the creek side where the soft ground muffled hoofbeats. They took 2 horses from the post's pen and a sack of grain from someone's storage, and were gone before anyone was properly awake. In the morning, all the settlement had was tracks and a busted latch and some disturbed mud. I knew about it because my people's camp was 3 miles north, and one of my young men had heard horses moving in the dark. He came and woke me. I got up and walked the perimeter in the cold and thought about it, and in the morning I rode to the settlement. Jensen wasn't glad to see me, but he listened. I told him what my man had heard, where the sound had come from, and what I'd read in the tracks afterward. They went south, which was not where our camp was, and the shoe marks were a mix of shod and unshod horses, which told me something about who was likely riding them. Jensen took the information and thanked me, and his eyes said things his mouth didn't. 3 of the other settlement men were there. They stood in a group in the way men stand when they have decided something among themselves and haven't said it out loud yet. One of them, a big man named Tully who had land on the east side of the creek, looked at me and looked at Jensen and said, "How do we know it wasn't his people?" Jensen said, "Did his people leave tracks going south?" Tully said, "We don't know whose tracks those are." I said, "They went south. My people's camp is north." Tully said nothing to me, just looked past me at the flat ground. That is a kind of answer. I rode back to camp and I told the elders what was being said in the settlement. The old woman Winona, who was 70 at least and had seen enough white men to understand how their fear worked, said, "Leave them alone long enough and they'll decide it was us anyway." She said it without heat. It was just an observation. She wasn't wrong. She usually wasn't. The second raid came in December, when the first snow had made the ground hard and reading tracks was easier, but pursuing anyone was harder. They took a pig and a sack of cornmeal from the farm south of the post, and they also took the farmer's rifle. That last thing was what scared the settlement more than the food. Food you can replace. A rifle taken means someone intends to use it on you. This time I didn't go to the settlement. I sent my nephew Thomas, who had enough English for the purpose. He went to Jensen and told him that we had seen riders coming from the south, not from the north, not from where our camp was, from the south, and that they looked like men without a real home. Mixed. Some white, some not, maybe 6 in all, moving without the kind of order that a band of any kind moves with, moving like desperate men move. Thomas came back and said Jensen had listened. That was all. Jensen had listened. Tully and 2 other men followed Thomas out of the settlement when he left. They didn't come all the way to our camp. They stopped on the ridge above the creek and looked down at our lodges, and then they went back. But they had counted us. I saw the tracks up on the ridge afterward. A man counts what he is deciding whether to be afraid of. That night I walked the perimeter of the camp in the cold. I was thinking about Tully on the ridge and about Jensen's eyes and about the arithmetic of the situation. And I was thinking, in the way the mind goes when you let it loose at night, about Marta's hands, about those open cracks, about the fact that it was December now and the water she washed in would be cold enough to hurt, and she would still be washing every day because there was always laundry. Because there is always laundry when you have animals and dirt and weather and a body. Some things don't stop because they are hard. You just do them. Jensen came to me after the second raid. He rode out alone, which I gave him credit for. He sat his horse outside the camp and waited, and I went out to him. He said the settlement was afraid. He said some of the men had sent word to the fort, and that soldiers would probably be coming to look into the raids. He looked at me steady when he said what came next. It would be better, he said, if my people were not nearby when the soldiers arrived. I asked him where he thought we should go. He didn't have an answer. He knew what I knew, that there was nowhere to go that wasn't someone else's territory or the army's line or a reservation where we would starve in a way that took longer and hurt more. I said, the raiders are south of here. They camp in the Red Rock break south of the fork. I have seen their fire from the high ground twice now. He looked at me for a long time. He said, I believe you. I said, does Tully? He said nothing. I said, if the soldiers come and see our smoke, they will make a decision before they ask a question. You know that is how it goes. He said he knew. I said, then here is what I am telling you. If there is trouble at any of your farms before the soldiers come, if those men come back and hit someone's place, send word to me. Don't wait for the soldiers. Send word to me. Jensen looked at me for a long moment. He said, why would you help? I said, because I live here too. I have always lived here, and because it is the right thing to do, and I am a man who does the right thing when he can tell which way it points. He nodded slowly. He rode back. I called the elders together that night. We talked until the fire burned low and started to die. Those who wanted to move north said the army would use any excuse and we shouldn't give them one. Those who said to stay said that moving looked like guilt and we had done nothing guilty. Winona said we had enough dried meat for 2 weeks if we were careful. She said it like it was the only practical thing worth saying. Maybe it was. I made the decision I had been making for years. I stayed. I watched. The third raid, they went to Marta's farm. I don't know why that one. Maybe the isolation, a mile south of the settlement, the sod house sitting alone on the flat with just one old milk cow, a pen of chickens, a dog that barked at everything and scared nothing. Maybe they had learned the settlement's layout well enough to know which places had no men. Maybe they were just hungry and getting bolder. My nephew came to me at first light and said there was smoke from the south. Not chimney smoke. Too much and the wrong color. Grass fire or structure burning. I didn't wait. I took 3 men and we rode hard. We came at the farm from the north and east, keeping a rise between us and the open ground so they wouldn't see us coming until we were close. I could see the shed burning as we came down off the rise. It was already well gone, the old boards catching fast in the dry air. The raiders were still on the property. 2 were by the root cellar, 1 loading and 1 watching. 1 was trying to catch the cow, which was moving around the pen in circles and not cooperating. A 4th sat his horse by the gate with a rifle across his lap. 4, maybe a 5th somewhere I couldn't see. I looked at my men. I looked at the man with the rifle. He was the first problem. We came in at a canter, not a run, enough speed to cover ground fast, not so fast we couldn't adjust. The man on the horse saw us first and he raised his rifle and I cut left and one of my men cut right and the shot went between us. By then we were close enough that the distance had collapsed and there was no time to reload and I rode straight at him. He broke. He pulled his horse around hard and drove his heels in and went south. And the other 3 saw him go and dropped what they had and followed. We went after them for half a mile, far enough to be sure they were running and not circling, and then I pulled up and waved my men back. I stood there a moment listening. The shed behind us was burning steadily. I could hear the cow in the pen. I could hear the chickens. I couldn't hear Marta. I turned back and I rode around the house calling out not her name, just a sound, a hello, and I heard the dog barking from the creek. That specific bark, close to something, staying. I found her in the willows at the creek edge, sitting in the mud with her back against a cottonwood and the old dog pressed against her legs. She had a single-shot pistol in her right hand. The kind of pistol that is mostly good for making a man think twice, not for actually stopping him. She must have grabbed it and run for the creek when they first came. She looked up at me. Her face was white under the weathering, the color a face goes when the body has used up its fear and is now running on something quieter. Her eyes were steady. I said, "They are gone." She said, "All four." I said, "All four." She looked at the pistol in her hand like she had forgotten she was holding it. She put it in her coat pocket and she tried to stand, and she was stiff from the cold mud, and she put out her hand without asking, and I took it, and I pulled her up. We stood there for a second, close enough that I could see the water on the side of her face from where she'd been against the wet bank. She said, "My shed is burning." I said, "Yes, we can put it out or let it go." She said, "Let it go, it was falling down anyway." We walked back from the creek and we stood in the yard and watched the shed burn down. My 3 men stood a few steps behind us, quiet. The cow had come back to the corner of the pen and was standing there with her head down looking aggrieved. The dog went and sat at Marta's feet. The shed fell in on itself in one long, slow movement and sent up a column of sparks into the cold morning air. We watched until it was done. Nobody said anything. Then Marta said, "Come inside." The inside of her house was what you would expect and also not. It was one room, low-ceilinged, smelling of earth and the stove and the mineral smell of cold water, a cot against one wall, a table and 2 chairs, a shelf with jars of preserved things she had put up from last summer. But on the wall, on a piece of board that she had sanded smooth and painted white, there was a small painting. Just a church. A small church somewhere in a green country with hills behind it, somewhere she had come from. She had painted it herself, I thought. It was not a professional painting, but it was true. The way things painted from memory are true. She put coffee on the stove. She put out 4 cups. There were exactly 4 cups, and there were 4 of us, and I noticed the precision of it, the way she measured everything to what she had. I told my men to wait outside. I sat at the table. She set a cup in front of me, and she stood on the other side of the table and she said, "Why did you come?" I said, "We saw the smoke." She said, "Yes, but why here first? Why not the settlement?" I thought about that honestly. I said, "I knew you were alone here." She looked at me for a moment. She sat down in the other chair. She said, "They think it was you, the settlement." I said, "Some of them." She said, "Tully came and told me I should be afraid of your people riding through." I said, "What did you say?" She said, "I said I'd watch for strangers coming from the south." She looked into her coffee cup. He didn't like that. I said, "A man who has decided what he thinks doesn't enjoy being told, he has decided wrong." She said, "Is that generous or just true?" I said, "Both, maybe." She wrapped her hands around the cup. I saw her wince when she did it, the heat of the cup on those cracked knuckles. She didn't move her hands. We sat. Outside, I could hear the last of the shed coming down. The dog scratched at the door and she got up and let him in, and he lay under the table near her feet. One of my men said something outside in Lakota, and another answered him quietly. She said, 12 years I have been on this land alone." I said nothing. She said, "The first few years I kept thinking he would come back. My husband. Isn't that strange? I knew he was dead. I buried him myself, but I kept expecting to hear him at the door." I said, "That is not strange." She said, "No, I suppose not." She looked at her hands around the cup. "After a while you stop expecting things, you just do the work." I said, "Yes." She said, "You do too, don't you?" It wasn't exactly a question. I said, "Yes." Tully came the next morning with 2 other men. I was in the yard splitting wood. I had slept in what was left of the barn, just the back wall and part of the roof, but enough for the horses and for me, and for one fire built small. I had sent 2 of my men back to camp, and 1 had stayed. When I heard the horses, I set the axe down, and I stood and I waited. Tully looked at me, looked at the axe, looked at the house. He said, "What are you doing here?" I said, splitting wood. He said, why? I said, because she is low on wood and it is winter. He said, I mean, why are you here, at this farm? I said, because yesterday 4 men came and took from this farm and burned her shed, and someone should be here today. He said, someone other than you. The door opened. Marta came out. She had her coat on and she was carrying her empty bucket. She had been going to the well and heard the horses. She looked at Tully and the men with him, and then she looked at me. Tully said to her, you know who he is? She said, I know who he is. He said, it isn't safe. And it isn't. He stopped, started again, people will talk. She said, William, were the men who raided this farm yesterday coming from his direction or from the south? She waited, from the south. And when they came, he and his men drove them off. She waited again, and you weren't here. Tully's face changed in a way that wasn't good. He said, that's not the point. She said, then what is? He said the point was what people would say. The point was decency. The point was. She picked up her bucket. She said, William, I have been on this land for 15 years. I have asked nothing from this settlement except to be left alone to work. I am asking that again now. Leave me alone to work. He sat his horse for a moment. He had things he wanted to say. I could see them in his face, a whole set of things. He chose not to say them. He looked at me with the look men use when they have decided to wait for another time. Then he turned his horse, and the other 2 men turned with him, and they rode back toward the settlement. I picked up the axe. Marta set her bucket down and looked at the growing woodpile. She said, I don't need you to stay. I said, I know. She said, but you can. Late afternoon. I had finished the wood and stacked it, and now I was at the trough washing my hands, and she came out with a fresh cup of coffee, and she stayed, leaning against the doorframe, watching the light change over the flat. I came to the step to get the cup. I looked at her hands on the doorframe. I said, sit down. She said, I'm fine. I said, I know, sit down anyway. She sat on the step. I crouched in front of her and I looked at her hands without touching them yet. The knuckles were not just cracked today, they were open, bleeding in the creases. The creek water and the lye and the winter air had worked on them for years, and today's cold had been the last requirement. The skin at the joints was the color of old brick and the color of fresh blood at the same time. She said, don't make a thing of it. I said, I'm not. I went on my horse and I took from my saddlebag a piece of deer hide, soft, brain-tanned, carried for repairs. I cut 2 strips with my knife, not long, just enough. I came back and I crouched in front of her again, and I took her right hand first. I turned it over to look at the palm, which was rough but intact, and then I turned it back and I wrapped the strip around the knuckles, not tight, just enough to keep the air off the open skin. I tucked the end under so it would hold, then her left. She sat still the whole time. Her hands were smaller than you would think for the work they had done, cold. The fingers were a little stiff when I moved them to wrap. I worked carefully. When I was done, I sat back on my heels and looked at what I had done. Not much, just 2 strips of hide, but they would keep the air out and let things begin to close. She looked at her hands for a long time. She turned them over and back. She said, that's going to be a problem at the washboard. I said, rest from the washboard. She almost laughed. Not quite, she said, everything needs washing. I said, tomorrow. She was quiet. She looked out across the flat toward the west where the sun had gone down behind the ridge and left a thin, cold line of orange light at the horizon. She kept her hands in her lap, both of them. Then she said, without looking at me, nobody has done anything like that for me in a long time. I said, it is not a large thing. She said, no, that is the kind that matters most. We sat on that step as the light failed and neither of us was in a hurry to move. The dog pressed against her leg. Somewhere out on the flat a coyote called once and stopped. The temperature dropped a few degrees while we sat there, and I felt it, and I thought she probably felt it too, and neither of us moved. The soldiers came in February. 4 of them, a young lieutenant and 3 enlisted men, riding out from the fort to look into the raids. They spent 2 days at the settlement talking to people and writing in their books. Then they went south and spent 2 more days in the red rock breaks past the fork. They found the camp where the raiders had been, cold ashes, some gear left behind, evidence of maybe 6 men. They found an old saddle that someone in the settlement identified as stolen from them in November. They came back through the settlement, and then they came to my camp. The lieutenant was young, 25 maybe. He had a careful face, the face of a man who has been taught to be cautious before he acts, which is a good quality in a soldier and a useful one in almost anyone. He asked me questions and I answered them. Where was my camp the night of the first raid? Where the night of the second? Could my nephew come and speak to them? My nephew came and spoke to them. Before the lieutenant left, he said, "You drive them off the Bower place." I said, "Yes." He wrote something, he said, "She told us the same thing." I said, "Then you have 2 people telling you the same thing." He looked at me, he said, "You know how this goes, it doesn't always matter what's true." I said, "I know." He said, "For what it's worth," he stopped. He thought about what he was going to say, he said, "It matters to me." He left and didn't come back. The raid stopped. Either the lieutenant had done something useful or the raiders had moved on to easier country. I thought the latter was more likely, and I thought Jensen probably thought the same. Spring came. My people began the talk of moving north for the summer, following the elk into the higher country. We had done this every year. The question was how much of that country was still open to us, and the answer was smaller every year and would be smaller next year, and you either move with what remains or you stop moving and accept what that means. I went to Marta's farm before we went north. She was at the Washboard, of course she was. The hide wraps were gone, they had lasted through the worst of the cold and then come off in the water one morning, and she had kept washing. I had expected that, but her hands looked better. The open cracks had closed mostly. The skin was still rough and red, but the bleeding was done. She looked up when I came around the corner of the burned shed, which she had not rebuilt. She said, "I wondered when you'd come." I said, "We are going north for the summer." She said, "Jensen told me you do that." I said, "Yes." She wrung out what was in her hands and dropped it in the bucket and straightened her back and dried her hands on her apron. She said, "Will you come back?" A plain question. She asked things the way she did everything, without ornamentation, without softening them into something easier to answer. I said, "This place is on the way." She said, "That isn't what I asked." I was quiet for a moment. The creek was running high with snowmelt and I could hear it from here, and there were meadowlarks somewhere in the grass to the east. Spring sounds. The world doing what it always did. I said, "Yes, I will come back." She nodded once. She reached back into the tub. I said, "I'll bring better hide when I come back." She didn't say anything, but when I turned to go she said my name, my Lakota name, not the word the whites used. She said it carefully, the way a person says something they have been practicing in their mind, getting the sounds in the right order. I stopped, I didn't turn around. She said, "Thank you for all of it." I said, I rode north. I am not going to tell you I thought about her the whole summer. I thought about my people. I thought about the country closing around us the way a hand closes, slowly, with patience, with the kind of force that doesn't have to hurry because it has all the time there is. I thought about Winona, who was slower this year than last, who had to be helped up in the mornings now. I thought about 2 of my young men who had started talking about the reservation, not because they wanted to go, but because they were looking at the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was hard. But sometimes at night I thought about the sod house on the flat, the painting of the church on the smoothed board, The way she had said leave me alone to work to Tully with the bucket in her hand, and the way she had said my name just once, getting the sounds right. A woman who does something once and does it right. That is a particular kind of person. I have led people for a long time. I have carried losses that I will not list here because they would take longer than this story to name. What I had not expected at my age was to find something quiet. Not a large thing, not hope exactly, not happiness, which is a young person's word. Something that felt like standing on solid ground when you have been walking uncertain ground for so long that you had forgotten what solid felt like. Somewhere to the south, there was a woman who had looked across a table at me and seen something, and had not been afraid of what she saw, and had not looked away. We stayed north through the summer into the dry part. We came south again in September when the first cold came off the high country, and the elk began to move. I rode to her farm first, before Jensen's, before the settlement. I came around the corner of the burned shed and she was not at the washboard. She was cutting branches for kindling. She looked up and she said, "You're back." I tied my horse. Without saying anything, I picked up the axe leaning against the house and I started splitting. She went back to cutting. We worked like that for an hour, maybe more, she cutting, I splitting. The dog lying in the thin September sun watching us with the wise laziness of an old dog who has learned that watching is enough. Once she threw a bad piece of wood for the dog to chase. The dog looked at it with great dignity and did not move. When the woodpile was done, she brought coffee and we sat on the step. I sat beside her, which I had not done before. I had crouched or stood. Sitting beside her on that step was different. She didn't say anything about it. I reached into my coat and I took out the hide. Better hide this time, elk, soft, cured well, the kind that stays soft even in the wet. I had cut it over the summer to what I thought was the right size, though I hadn't been certain. I had thought about her hands enough times that summer that I had a good idea. She held out her hands without me asking. Her knuckles were open again. The summer had not been kind to them. It never was. I wrapped her right hand. I wrapped her left. I used a longer strip this time, tied differently, and when I was done I held her hands in mine for a moment without deciding to. Just held them. Her hands were cold from the morning air. She didn't pull away. She said, "I told Jensen you come back." I said, "What did he say?" She said, "He said he wouldn't bet against you." I said, "That is about right." She turned her hands in mine and looked at the wrapping. Then she looked up at me. It was a look that a person gives when they have thought about something for a long time and reached a decision, and are now telling you the decision without words. She kept looking at me. I said, "I cannot stay here, not the way some people stay." She said, "I know." I said, "My people." She said, "I know, I'm not asking that." I said, "Then what are you asking?" She said, "Nothing." She looked at our hands. "I'm just telling you that I'm glad you came back, and I'm glad you'll come back again, and that's enough for me." I sat with that. I said, "That is a harder thing to say than it sounds." She said, "Most of the true ones are." Jensen told me later that winter that Tully had made some noise about a Lakota chief coming and going from the Bower woman's farm. Jensen said Tully had used words I am not going to repeat, and some of the other men had agreed and some had not. What settled it, Jensen said, was a January storm that came down hard and hit the settlement for 4 days and left the flat under 2 feet of drifted snow, and the temperature down far enough that the nails in the door frames contracted and the doors wouldn't close right. When it lifted, Marta's 2 cows were dead, the old one and the one she had gotten in the fall. Her water line was frozen solid, and she was low on firewood because she hadn't been able to cut for 4 days. It was not Tully who went to her farm with wood and a pick to break the ice. It was Jensen and 2 other men from the settlement. But when they got there, the woodpile was already fresh stacked. The water line was already running, someone having dug down to it and replaced a frozen section with a piece of pipe. And Marta was inside warm with her stove going. Jensen said Tully asked who had done it. She said, my neighbor. Tully said, you don't have a neighbor. She said, I do. Jensen said Tully didn't say much after that. He told me the story like it was funny, but I don't think it was funny exactly. I think it was just a thing that had been one way and was now another way. Things change sometimes without a big moment. One small stubborn fact won't move, and whatever was pressing against it has to go somewhere else or just stand there and wear out. I will not tell you everything was easy after that. It wasn't. The army extended its line. We lost 2 good hunters to a fever the following winter. We lost Winona in October. She died in her lodge on a clear morning with the light coming in the way she would have wanted, and we buried her well and moved on because that is what you do. The young men who had been talking about the reservation, one went, one stayed. I didn't try to tell either of them what was right. I was not sure I knew. I kept going south, fall and sometimes spring. I brought what I could meat when we had it, a good hide, once a woven blanket from a council meeting that I had no use for and that I thought would fit her cot, and it did. She gave me coffee and food and the step and the conversation that was mostly not conversation, but something better than that, 2 people in the same place at the same time, both comfortable being there. She never healed, not fully. The hands. The years of cold water and lie and open air had done what they had done, and that didn't undo. But every time I came I brought hide and I wrapped them and she let me. And once she said, not sentimentally, just as plain fact, the way she said everything, that those days when the wraps were fresh were the only days her hands didn't wake her at 3 in the morning. I thought about that for a long time, about all the nights she had been woken up by the pain in her hands and had just laid there waiting for morning because there was nothing else to do. All those years, nobody to ask, nobody to wrap anything. The last time I came to her farm was October. The cottonwoods along the creek were all gold, every one of them, moving in a light wind off the hills. The kind of afternoon the country gives you 2 or 3 times in the fall, warm and clear, and already beginning to smell of cold coming. I came around the corner of the burned shed, which she had never rebuilt, and she was not at the washboard. She was sitting on the step. In all the years I had come to that farm, I had never come around that corner and found her sitting in the middle of the day. She was always at the washboard or cutting wood or mending or going to the well. Sitting was not something she did when the sun was up. She looked up at me and she said, I knew you'd come today. I said, did you? She said, sit down. I sat on the step beside her. We looked out at the flat. The cottonwoods along the creek were all moving, all that gold moving at once, a slow, deliberate movement in the light air. The new dog, the old one had died 2 springs ago, lay at her feet with his chin on his paws. She said, my daughter wrote. She wants me to come east. I said nothing. She says I'm too old to be out here alone. She's probably right. I said probably. She said, don't agree with her. I said, she's right about the alone part. She looked at me, she said, what does that mean? I didn't answer right away. I looked at the cottonwoods, I said, it means what it means. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, I'm not going east. I said, good. She said, I'm going to die on this land. I decided that 12 years ago when my husband died and I stayed, and I've made the same decision every year since. I'm making it again now. I said, all right. She looked at the flat. The sun was well past its highest point and was going toward the ridge. 2 more hours of light, maybe. She held out her hands. She held them out like she was showing me something, presenting an object that had a history. They were worse than I had seen them. The years had thickened the joints and the skin was thinner now, more fragile looking, the kind of skin that tears if you aren't careful. The old cracks had become permanent ridges. There was nothing left unused in those hands. They had been used completely, every part of them. I reached into my coat. I had brought hide, as I always did now. This time the very soft kind, the kind the women in my band used for wrapping the babies, the softest thing I knew. I cut it, and I wrapped her right hand and her left. I tied them carefully, a little more carefully than usual because the skin was more fragile now, and when I was done, I held her hands in both of mine, and I sat there with the sun on us both. She looked at our hands. She said, "You know what I thought the first time you did this?" I said, "Tell me." She said, "I thought, who is this man, sitting in the dirt wrapping my hands like I'm worth taking care of?" She paused. I hadn't thought that about myself in a long time, that I was worth taking care of. I said, "You were always worth it." She said, "I know that. I just needed someone to act like it." We sat there as the light got long and gold. The cottonwoods went on moving in the wind. The dog sighed in his sleep and shifted. Somewhere across the flat a hawk was making wide circles over the grass, not hunting, just moving because moving felt good. After a while Marta leaned her shoulder against mine. Just slightly. The way you lean against something solid when you are tired and have decided you are where you mean to be. I didn't move. The light went gold across everything, the flat, the dry grass, the yellow trees along the creek. The dog woke up and looked at us and decided we were fine and went back to sleep. The hawk made a few more circles and went somewhere we couldn't see. Neither of us was in a hurry. There was nowhere else I needed to be. There was no place on that land I needed to be except on that step, with those wrapped hands in mine, with the light going down over a country that had taken a great deal from both of us and had given us this. That is the story. That is what I have. A man gets to a certain age and he takes account. What was I? What did I do with what I had? The army took the country. The years took the people I loved. The work took what it always takes. Those are not complaints, they are just the items in the account. On the other side, I drove off the men who came for her place in the cold at first light, and I did not hesitate. I split her wood. I wrapped her hands with whatever hide I had, with whatever softness I could find. And I came back, every fall, sometimes in the spring. I came back because she was worth coming back to, and because sitting on that step in the evening light was about as close to peace as I had come in a long time. And she made room. A woman who had made room for nothing and nobody for 15 years looked across that table at me and made room. She stood on her step with her bucket and chose her side. She learned to say my name right and said it once when it needed to be said. In a country that spent a long time deciding I was the wrong kind of man in the wrong place, one woman looked across a table and saw something different. You carry that. You don't put it down. The cottonwoods were still gold when I left that evening. I could see them from the ridge looking back, a strip of yellow light along the creek in the dark flat, bright enough to see from a long way off. They stayed in my sight until the ridge put the valley behind me.